we are all connected. I mean, I think the most fundamental thing is we're all connected by an energy field. We swim in a sea of light, basically, which is the zero-point field. And I say, first of all, you get away from the whole idea of separateness, because separateness is the biggest problem of the world now.
You take this notion of an entangled universe and you apply it to human experience, because human experience is part of the universe as well. And then you say, well, let's assume that experience is entangled, then how would it manifest? And we can start going through ways in which it could manifest. If there's a connection with another mind, we call it telepathy. If there's a connection to some other object somewhere else, we'd call it clairvoyance. If there's a connection that happens to transcend time, we'd call it precognition. If there's a connection in which my intention is expressed out in the world some way, we might call it psychokinesis or distant healing or something of that sort. So you can go through a list of perhaps 12 kinds of psychic experience that have gotten labels over the years, like telepathy, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Actually, we did this at a conference when we asked people how many people have had a gut feeling and so on, and 80% of the people say, and then they say, among those of you who are very skeptical of unconventional claims, how many of you, meaning now like 30% of the audience who doesn't believe in any of this stuff, how many of you guys have had interesting gut feelings that turned out to be right? 80%. So when people are skeptical about unusual things, it's completely understandable because there's all kinds of nonsense out there. But when you bring those phenomena into the lab and you exclude all of the ordinary ways of understanding them, it turns out that they do have a psychic component.
There's a video right there I just watched a minute ago about the double slit and how you can actually perform it yourself.
Oh, yeah.
With a laser and 3 pencil leads. It's pretty cool. You can use anything to make the 2 slits with. It's pretty cool. This guy here shows how, you do just 1 slit and you get the particle pattern. You just get 1 dot on the wall. But if you put 2 slits, it spreads out into a band as a wave. And if you put a cross there, like a double slit turn.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes it a somatic pattern. It starts a somatic pattern. Nice. Forms in both directions. Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. There's no question the light is a wave energy. I don't know why they think it's particle to begin with.
Well, I think that there's a duality. I think that it is a wave, and it's that wave function that when it collapses becomes a particle. I don't think that there's anything necessarily like spooky about it, other than it's a wave of probability until it makes a free will decision to coalesce into whatever particle that it wants to become.
Yeah, I agree. There's like a ether of the energy, which is matter.
Right.
That's not existed yet. It's there all the time,
Right. It's a wave of probability of like that. I think that that's what electricity is. It's just that playing field of pure consciousness, of pure potentiality.
Yeah. And it has an intelligent nature to it.
Absolutely.
Both ends of its scale too. It's not like a singularity intelligence. It's more like an overall intelligent thing. I don't know.
Right. Well, like if you look at, the difference between a neural net or, the way that the electrical interactions between galaxies work, it's the same, macro and micro.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, biology and the research into cells that we know now, that it's incredible. I mean, an individual cell is almost like an industrial manufacturing plant, with literally hundreds, thousands of workers, doing their own thing. It's incredible.
Yeah, I don't see how the Earth as an individual cell is any different than a red blood cell. That red blood cell is its own living organism. It does not know that it's a part of a greater body of man, so
there's a lot of space.
Like the Russian nesting dolls of infinite potentiality.
Yeah, the amount of in almost intellectual particles in that cell. I mean, when they're observed, you can see They all have a different part to play, and if they don't do their job right, the thing doesn't work right. I mean, it's incredible to watch some of the videos on YouTube about what we know about a cell now. It is incredible, and I mean, it's full of intelligence, completely full. It's almost compared to looking down at the people in a city. The amount of particles and what these particles do inside that cell. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Fascinating, that duality, when the observer observes it, the effect, changes where it no longer is a wave, it starts acting like a particle again, just through observation.
Yeah. I think that and I have questions and notes in my own outlines of things that I plan on speaking with Dean about, and that definitely comes largely into play. But I really don't see how it violates anything if it is the playing field of matter, if it is that free will application that creates that wave of probability to make a decision and forces it either forces it, compels it, attenuates it, coalesces it, whatever word you want to use, but to gather together as an actual particle, that's when it becomes manifest. And I think at that point of manifestation, at that instance of origin, that's where time would be created for each individual piece of matter. Therefore, I personally feel like time would have to be subjective based upon each individual little photon creation.
What's incredible is when you realize these little particles have almost a mind or an intention of their own.
Absolutely.
Well, you have to ask yourself, wait a minute, what part do they play in this reality? Because if our intelligent observation has an effect on it, then their intelligent observation should have an effect on it as well. And so, it's hard to say whether it's incredible to think about, really.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's pull Dean in here and let's get his opinion on it.
Awesome.
All right.
Hello, Dean here.
Hi, Dean. This is Trevor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We got with us Billy's on the call today and Lilith. And we just want to say thank you for your time and coming on and talking to us today. We're fascinated with your work. We've been following your work for several years. We loved your appearance on the Thunderbolts project, his YouTube video, and she spoke at the conference. Thought that was just brilliant.
Thank you.
Well, it is my absolute honor to bring to everybody our next guest. Dean is one that I've been following the work of for at least the last 11 years. Dean, you've been a huge inspiration to me personally. You've provided me with my foundations in scientific interests, so it's genuinely heartfelt when I say thank you to Trevor for giving me this opportunity to be able to interview you, one of my heroes. So a gigantic thank you to you, Dean, for agreeing to be on our show today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for that.
Oh. Well, Dean, let me give our listening audience just a bit of background on you. Dr. Radin is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS, in Petaluma, California, and you continue your work at the Department of Psychology at Sonoma State University. Dr. Radin has published over 200 technical papers and is the author of 3 books, including 1997 Conscious Universe, The Scientific Truth of Psychic Phenomena, 2006 Entangled Minds, Extrasensory Experiences and Quantum Reality, and 2013 Supernormal, Science, Yoga, and the Evidence for Extraordinary Psychic Abilities. Dean attained his Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering, where he graduated magna cum laude with honors in physics from the University of Massachusetts. Dean attained his Master's of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Illinois with a focus on cybernetics and control systems, and has also attained his doctorate PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois. Dr. Radin has also worked in advanced research and development with AT&T Laboratories, GTE Laboratories, the U.S. Navy, DARPA, in classified programs investigating psychic phenomenon for the U.S. government, which brings to mind the 2009 film Men Who Stare at Goats. And Dean has a brilliant wit about him, and even entitled his 2013 Electric Universe Conference presentation, Men Who Stare at Photons. Definitely worthwhile watching, and linked for everyone to bookmark. For those in our community who are not familiar with Dr. Radin, let me just quickly add that Dean is also a proponent of the Electric Universe Theory and the Thunderbolts Project, which we here at the Suspicious Observers Collective also wholeheartedly endorse. In fact, it was through my pursuits in following Dr. Radin's work personally that I was first introduced to the Thunderbolts Project to begin with. So thank you, Dean, for helping me find my life's purpose. I'd like to begin with my introduction to you and your work, Dean, which for me began immediately after watching your 2004 feature film, What the Bleep Do We Know? Down the Rabbit Hole. Dr. Radin, could you please summarize the idea of the film for those in our audience who have yet to see it?
Well, I was, of course, just one of a number of people in that film, and actually not in the original first release, but in the second release. The first release was a little bit shorter, and the reason that they came out with a second version of it some 6 months later or so is because the film was getting criticism that there were scientific issues that are being talked about, but not enough scientists who were able to address them. So I was brought in as the second wave. The idea of the film was kind of a combination of the power of positive thinking and affirmations, and trying to wrap that together with what amounts to the ontology suggested by quantum mechanics. And it's debatable as to how accurate all of the portions were, but it was important, I think, because it created a new genre for independent documentaries. Because up to that point, I don't think there were any films that tried to combine what amounts to our understanding of the modern physical world with consciousness. And they did it in a lighthearted, entertaining way, and it spawned many additional films that are still being done today. In fact, I'm filming one on Tuesday. So in that regard, the film is important. And as I said, the point of it was to try to mix together our ontological understanding of reality based on quantum mechanics, which ultimately there's really very little agreement even today.
Now, Dr. Radin, how would you describe the role of consciousness and its relationship with quantum mechanics?
I was asked the same question last October when I gave a talk in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia at a conference. And it struck me as very funny because the lady who asked the question was a sincere newspaper reporter, and she needed like one paragraph for me to answer that question. And I just thought it was funny because you can't answer that in one question in a paragraph. And so I started to laugh, and I felt bad for her because she had a kind of a puzzled look on her face, not knowing what she had said that was funny. So I had to explain it to her. So what's the role of consciousness and its relationship with quantum mechanics is a tough question because we don't actually know what consciousness is, and there's no agreement as to what quantum mechanics means. So that said, I think the relationship is that one of the interpretations of quantum mechanics is that there is something peculiar about the observer of a physical system. And that actually is the primary reason why quantum mechanics is different than classical mechanics. In classical mechanics, it's assumed that all objects are completely separate, that you can observe a system and you have no influence on that system at all. That's been a very successful paradigm, and that's the way that most science and technology arose until about maybe the 1950s. What quantum mechanics shows is that you can no longer make the assumption that objects are completely separate. And we're talking about separate in space and time. quantum mechanics shows that things are connected through space and time. And in addition, there's the possibility raised by founders of quantum mechanics, including John von Neumann, who is the person who basically put the theory on a firm mathematical grounding, that there's something about consciousness or awareness that seems to be necessary in order to take the quantum potential world, which is wave-like, and turn it into the world that we perceive, which is particle-like. Now, von Neumann today and other prominent people involved in the foundations of quantum mechanics, their opinion is probably considered a minority opinion at this point. Most working physicists today would probably say that consciousness has nothing to do with quantum mechanics at all. On the other hand, if you look at conferences and surveys of people who have specialized in the interpretation of quantum mechanics, there's actually no consensus at all. There's something like a dozen different interpretations. Some people accept that consciousness is important in some way. Many others don't, but there's no one agreement. So it remains an outstanding problem, and maybe consciousness has something to do with it, and maybe not. My own prejudice is, based on experiments that I've done, is that there's something peculiar about consciousness, in particular awareness, that is related to what's happening in quantum mechanics. But I'm not speaking for the majority by any means.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Radin, would you please describe for us exactly what the quantum measurement problem is, otherwise known as the observer effect?
Well, as I just alluded to, it's the idea that when you observe a quantum object, that its behavior changes. And this is seen most dramatically in simple experiments like the double slit experiment, where if you gain information about the movement of a photon through a double slit apparatus, or an electron or anything, actually, that can make it through two slits, it will behave in a particle-like fashion. And if you don't gain information about which of the two slits it goes through, it will behave like a wave. So there's disagreements about what it means to gain information or to observe, but the fact is that any means by which you gain information about what a particle is doing will cause it to behave like a particle. Otherwise, it behaves like a wave. And so that statement is not controversial at all. It's well accepted. What's not well accepted is why does that happen? And again, there's probably a half a dozen explanations for why it happens, but the fact that it happens, it still remains a problem.
I know that your experiments have proven that attenuation will collapse wave function through observation. And a major component of what we do here at the Suspicious Observers Collective is to watch the sun and to observe those patterns and changes. It's been postulated that perhaps by the very nature of our act of scrutinizing observance, that we are in turn affecting the sun itself. We've noted that a significant amount of coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, which fire off of the limb, which is from the sides, or as well as firing on the back side, the non-Earth facing side, but that there has been a detectable lack of Earth-directed CMEs, also where the SDO, the Solar Dynamics Observatory, is located. In your experiments with quantum optics and the role of observation collapsing wave function, would you suppose that such scrutiny is perhaps affecting the very action of Earth-directed solar flaring events? What's your opinion on this matter?
You mentioned in the beginning of your comment that my experiments prove that attenuation will collapse wave function. And so two comments here. One is that our experiments don't prove anything. Experiments provide evidence. And the distinction is important because science is not about proof. The other thing is that you mentioned the word attenuation, and I think you mean attention, right? Attenuation means a reduction of something.
My apologies.
Yeah, you mean attention. Okay. So, in sum, then, does our attention of the sun change the the corona mass discharges away from the Earth, and maybe thereby protecting us in some way. Is that the intention of your question?
Yeah. I think that that's at the heart of it.
Yeah, I think what she's referring to is the case that here in the recent last decade of observation of the sun, that we've noticed that there seems to be a similar event to what was recorded during the Maunder minimum, during another period of time where there was heavy observation of the sun, in which case there were no reported solar, or very few, Earth-facing flares. Mm-hmm. And we're wondering, is it possible that the sheer act of observation now is causing this effect?
Well, is it possible? I would say yes, it's possible. Is it likely? I would say probably not. What would be interesting would be first of all, are these mass ejection events, are they uniformly distributed around the sun? I don't know. But if they were, then you'd be able to make a probabilistic statement as to the likelihood that it would actually be pointed at the Earth. So I don't know what these answers are. I'd need a solar physicist to explain it all. But is it possible that observation is changing these super macroscopic events? Because that's what they are. I mean, those coronal mass ejections are much larger than the entire Earth. So would a small percentage of sentient life on that planet be sufficient to prevent these huge macroscopic events in the cosmos? It sounds like that. Many things are possible, but in this case, it doesn't seem very likely.
Okay, very good.
Because even in terms of biomass, just set aside sentience for a minute, in terms of biomass, humans are not actually that much. They look at forests and insects and all of the other creatures, living creatures on Earth, and we're a small percentage of it all.
That's a very good point.
Well, Dr. Radin, your laboratory results have indicated that electromagnetism can influence your testing results, and that's why you conduct your experiments in environments as free of electromagnetic disturbances as possible, such as out on the isolated desert playa at Burning Man, or inside of a Faraday cage or an electromagnetically shielded room. Your tests have evidenced that psi phenomenon improves in low geomagnetic conditions and is worsened in high geomagnetic conditions. What would you say the effect of is on social consciousness would be in the case of, say, that solar dormancy, a low geomagnetic condition, or conversely a severely weakened magnetosphere, which is Earth's magnetic shield, and also a high geomagnetic condition? In your opinion, how would those factors play into the role of consciousness in the physical world?
Well, there's an interesting study by the Fed, the Federal Reserve, looking at the role of geomagnetic storms on the stock market worldwide. So they looked at stock markets around the world and compared it against the geomagnetic indices on a daily basis. And they found what is consistent with what many other studies have found, which is during geomagnetic storms, people become agitated and the stock markets drop. And this is true in every stock exchange in the entire world. So violence goes up, and heart attacks are more frequent, and all kinds of physical and behavioral effects are clearly associated with the magnetosphere. And that, of course, is linked to the sun and to the position of the planets and all kinds of interesting cosmological linkages. So is there a social component or social influence of large-scale behavior, geocosmic behavior? I think the answer is clearly yes. The reason, by the way, that we use shielded spaces for our experiments is partially because we know that in most places around the world, you're saturated with all kinds of electromagnetic frequencies, from moderately low to very high, and they're impossible to escape. So when we put somebody inside a room that is shielded so that from about 10 kilohertz and above is almost completely gone, they usually report feeling very and unusually relaxed and quiet. And so we point out to them that the room is actually not acoustically shielded. It is a little bit, just in the same way that almost any room would be acoustically shielded, but it's not specifically an anechoic chamber. It's not designed to block sound. It only blocks electromagnetics. And yet people report it as quiet because they don't recognize that when you're out there in the world and surrounded by Wi-Fi and everything else, it actually does agitate the nervous system. And so when you go into a quiet environment and there's no Wi-Fi and there's no radio and there's no cell phones and all the rest, it feels quiet because your nervous system is actually calmed down. And so we use that environment not so much because we think that electromagnetics will interfere with psi, but it does interfere with your ability to simply calm down and pay attention to what's going on inside your head. And that's where most of our experiments take place, something inside your mind.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that. I've noticed recently I started grounding with silver sheets and taking the voltage off of my body and trying to balance it with ground potential to zero. And I've found that it really helps to balance my moods. I've been diagnosed, as bipolar, and the effect of just grounding has been tremendous on bringing balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, many people report that if they sleep on a sheet that is grounded, that they'll sleep a lot better.
Yeah, I can vouch for that, definitely. I think Billy's tried it out here recently, too, and he's been pretty impressed with...
just one night, so remains to be seen, I guess.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I did have a noticeably better night's sleep than I had noticed before. Sure did.
I noticed it took me about 4 days. The first night that I slept grounded, I was awoken suddenly to noises on the other side of the house. It was almost as though my perception was intensified through just the sheer act of grounding in that state of mind. And then I also noticed with my wife, the first night that she slept on it, she had a really similar effect, and it bothered her to the point where she got up and actually went and slept in another room. And I told her it took a few days to get used to it, and it took me about 4 days, I think, to really get into it, where I was sleeping a good 9 hours of sleep. I had been reduced to 4 hours and even 2 hours during my duration in the hospital. I spent about 6 months fighting cancer, and it really messed up my sleep patterns to where I developed a 2-hour sleeping pattern or a 4-hour sleeping pattern. But just through the act of grounding, it seemed to stabilize the circadian rhythm and provide a nice balanced sleep pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've noticed when, as I said, we bring people into the shielded room and they feel calm and relaxed, but about 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 people will suddenly either start crying because they don't know how to make sense of the new feeling that they suddenly experienced, or they'll suddenly get claustrophobia and they weren't claustrophobic before. So people will interpret that this lack of something. They're feeling the lack of the electromagnetics and interpret it in different ways. Most people feel good about it, but some actually become even more agitated because they get concerned.
Yeah, that's odd, because I was just dead to the world, which I never had trouble going to sleep. Just staying asleep was my problem. I could sleep more than a couple of hours. No bad back. You had to get up and move. But I did notice I slept a lot longer, several hours long, which is unusual for me. So.
Yeah, well, keep it up.
A deeper sleep, I noticed. If anything, I was in a deep sleep. I didn't hear anything. I was out.
Yeah, I noticed more lucid dreaming and more of a deep REM type of sleep, too.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, we'll find out here.
Good.
Yeah, What else you got for us, Lily?
I was going to ask Dr. Radin, in addition to his investigations on psi phenomenon, what some of our listeners may not know is that Dean also has a background as a classic violinist, beginning at the age of 5. I know you're a brilliant man, Dr. Radin, so I'm sure you're probably familiar with cymatics, or the study of visible effects of sound vibrations on physical matter.
Yes.
For those in our listening audience that don't know, in 1680, Robert Hooke ran a violin bow along the edge of a glass plate coated in flour. And along each pitch, a new nodal pattern would begin to physically emerge from the wave function. Ernst Caldini documented the various emergent patterns, which are now known as Caldini patterns of figures, that when a pitch corresponds to a certain frequency, that acoustical wave contains power. And when those various pitches are played, that those tonal vibration patterns will change, corresponding to each new frequency. Your experiments with light reveal the intensity and attention effect outcomes. Would you say that Caldini patterns of all matter would originate as a wave and become a particle when the power of intent, such as free will, to be able to coalesce into a specific new frequency, collapses that wave function, or conversely gathers it all together as matter?
Well, you're asking about the ontology of physical reality. What is it really made of? How does it work? And nobody knows. What we know, or at least what we suspect at this point, is that there's some way that awareness interacts with the physical world, where it seems not only to collapse wave-like structures into particle-like systems, but more that it seems to steer the quantum potentials, or maybe not even quantum potentials. It steers some unknown potential world into the world that we see it. And I'm using the word steering to indicate that it's not simply that observing a system will cause it to collapse into a particle, but rather that observing in context, you observe in a certain way, you get certain kinds of information from a system. That information seems to push the quantum potentials into one form or another. And so if we step back and think of this from a parapsychological point of view, we use words like psychokinesis, which suggests that the mind is directing how some aspect of the world is actually behaving. Well, after some experiments that we've recently conducted, I've begun to think that in a double slit system, that when you observe what's going on there, it's not simply that it's so-called collapsing the wave function, but rather collapsing it in a certain way. There could be an infinite number of ways that you can collapse a wave into a particle, and the actual direction or the means by which it collapses seems to be dependent on the nature of the feedback that you give the person, or the instructions that you give to the person. So this actually is more interesting than simply a passive observational effect, because it kind of suggests that we are engaged, as John Wheeler said, we live in a participatory universe, that there's something about the nature of our observation, perhaps free will, that is helping to shape the way that the world actually is. Not just the way that we perceive it, but the way that it is objectively. So this is still, it is by no means a settled question within psi research or within physics, but that's what my best guess is right now. That we do live in a participatory universe, and we're engaged in some way in helping it to manifest in the way that we perceive it.
I absolutely agree with that. I know that a large part of your experimentation focuses on entanglement. Would you perhaps say that entanglement is the bond of force between two particles, or how gravity is created, that force field of frequency or attention that holds that matter together, like the gluons between space and matter?
Well, entanglement doesn't involve force. So thinking of it in terms of a glue may not make sense. What entanglement suggests is that the properties of elementary particles, and perhaps in macroscopic states as well, that they're not separate. So if anything, entanglement is suggesting that we really do live in a holistic environment. Everything is connected with everything else all the time. In most cases, at least in our everyday world, we can't see those connections very easily unless they spontaneously pop up as a psychic experience, or in a physics lab where you do very precise measurements of pairs of photons or electrons. But the implication of entanglement, especially now a new form or a new language about entanglement, which is called quantum discord, it suggests that there are forms of entanglement that exist everywhere all the time, and even different degrees of entanglement. So you may know that if you take a pair of something and they go off in their separate ways, it's fairly simple, even from a classical perspective, to imagine that they're simply correlated. Like, you take two balls and you throw them at the same time, they are coming from the same person, and so there's going to have a common source, and thereby the two balls will have some things that are going to be correlated with each other, maybe spin, maybe something else. But quantum entanglement is saying that if you take two things, they interact and then they go on their separate ways, it's not only that they're correlated, but they're correlated more strongly than any form of classical correlation. And the reason is that quantum particles don't have separate identities. They don't even have properties in the usual way of thinking of something having a property. So if you have properties that are shared between particles, they're not really separate. So this new thing about quantum discord, it's a strange word, discord. It sounds like opposite to what it really is. But what it means is that quantum entanglement in an elementary sense has been shown in the laboratory at this point, mainly with pairs of photons or pairs of electrons. That is a very strong form of entanglement. But there are weaker forms, and there are forms that go all the way down to classical kinds of correlations and all the way up to these very strong forms of quantum entanglement correlations. And all of them exist all the time. So that means that the importance of this is that you take something that is considered probably not quantum by many physicists, which is the human brain. So the human brain is considered to be too hot and too wet to sustain quantum coherence, which is the magic underneath quantum entanglement. But thinking of it from the point of view of quantum discord, where you have different degrees of entanglement, you can suddenly see that even something as hot and wet as the human brain probably has various forms of entanglement going on in there all the time. And if that's the case, it means that you can consider the brain as something which really is connected with the rest of the universe to some degree. Probably not to a huge degree, but that it is connected to the universe to any degree at all suddenly makes the concept of mystical experience and psychic experience much more plausible. Because now your brain and your mind are literally connected with the rest of the universe through space-time.
Oh, that's fascinating. I had a quick question, Deep. While I was watching the film, What the Bleep Do We Know? The one thing that really stuck out to me was the fact that we can influence the past, that this works in both ways. Could you explain that effect a little bit?
Well, again, if there's any form of quantum connection happening with the mind or the brain, then quantum effects do not occur in ordinary space-time. They occur outside of space-time. The moment that you imagine that, you can see how the ordinary flow of time is no longer relevant. So you can participate in something in the past or in the future. The idea that you can influence the past may not be correct. It's more like if we may be able to participate in events that occurred in the past, but we're participating in them now, in the present. Another way to say it is when you do an experiment, imagine, for example, that you have a random number generator. On Monday, you record 1 megabyte of random bits, but nobody looks at it. You just record it on a hard disk somewhere and you set it aside. So at that point, they're not observed, at least not by a conscious entity. And the possibility arises then that if observation affects the manifest world, then until somebody actually looks at those bits, you don't know what they are. So now the end of the week comes along, say Friday, and you play back those bits that were recorded on Monday. You're playing them back on Friday, and on Friday you give people instructions, well, try to mentally make some of the bits ones and make some of the other bits zeros, and those experiments work. So one interpretation is that on Friday, when you're doing this experiment, that you're changing the past on Monday, and you're kind of forcing the bits to go in various directions by going backwards in time. But a more likely explanation is that you're actually not changing anything. What you're doing on Friday is participating with what was happening on Monday. So you're participating from the future into the present on Monday, because if this idea is correct, that the mind is not in space-time, or not in ordinary space-time, then a portion of your attention on one day can affect what was happening as it occurred in a previous day. The implication of that is that if you pay a lot of attention to something happening in the present, then you have less ability to affect it in the future. Because if you're paying attention to it in the present, you, in a sense, collapse it and make it so that it's not going to change anymore. Whereas if you don't pay too much attention to something happening in the present, then there is a possibility that it can be influenced by you or somebody else in the future. And the pragmatics of this is, if you think about human health, that there are the occasional spontaneous remissions that occur, and some of those occur in a strange way when you think of it in time. You have cases of somebody who goes into the hospital and they have something like a bony tumor. These are things that involve bone and a lot of mass, and then they have some kind of miraculous thing occur, and they come back a couple days later and they take an x-ray and it's gone. It's completely missing. Well, it's called a miracle or a spontaneous remission, and the miracle is that how could something like that disappear overnight? It's not possible. Well, one possibility is that those kinds of effects involve something like a retrocausal influence. So imagine that you track on a graph the progression of a disease. Well, a lot of it has inertia in it. So if you have a certain disease, it's going to keep going in the same direction. But what if you were able to go back mentally before the disease began? Now you're influencing something that you weren't paying attention to in your body because you weren't ill at that point. But if you're able to deflect the future course of that illness, then maybe you would have a period of time where it flares up, and that's when you notice it. But you were able to catch it before it got too bad, and then it would basically just drop away. It would flare up, but it would go away because you changed the course of its future. So this brings up the idea of retrocausal healing, and there have been a couple of experiments looking at this, and they suggest, they don't prove at this point, but they do suggest that there might be a way of interacting with our own health by going back before the effect began to manifest and actually changing its future course. So this all sounds extremely bizarre, except that one of the leading edges in physics now, and thinking about quantum effects, is that the present is influenced not only by the past, but by the future. And so this becomes similar to what I've been talking about in terms of trying to retroactively change a course of a health outcome. The present is influenced by the past and the future.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating.
It can make your brain hurt a little bit when you start thinking about this, because our language is based on tenses, which assume a uniform forward direction of time. And that's why when you start talking about these things, they sound crazy. But from a physics perspective, at elementary levels, time is symmetric. All of the equations of classical and quantum mechanics are completely time symmetric. And so part of the mystery then is, and why don't we see that more often at the everyday scale? Well, there's a lot of inertia in the world. That's one reason. And the second law of thermodynamics provides another reason. But occasionally there's room for the present to be influenced by the future.
Wow.
Dr. Radin, would you view consciousness itself as being the very fabric of space-time, that consciousness is the fundamental force?
I would say not force, but is consciousness more fundamental than mass, energy, space, and time? That's the question. That's how I would pose the question. And I'm beginning to think that that is a viable explanation. And part of it is because you think of science as kind of a pyramid, where from a conventional perspective, the bottom of the pyramid is physics. There's where mass, energy, space, and time live, basically. And they're taken as a given. So that's like the fundamental assumption. That's what physics is. And then you start building on that basis of the pyramid. So the next level up is going to be something like chemistry, and then you'll have biology. And somewhere at the very top of the pyramid, you have psychology. And above that, you have maybe, or in the same area, you have neuroscience, psychology, and then consciousness as an emergent property all the way at the top. That's the way that the mainstream is in science, and consciousness emerges somehow magically out of all of this stuff below. And some of that is almost certainly correct. Each layer of science has a lot of experience now in being able to describe the world pretty accurately. And if it wasn't for occasional anomalies that we call psychic and occasionally mystical experience, there would be no reason to actually think that that pyramid was wrong. But the reason that, given that we can do experiments on psi phenomena, we know that some aspect of that pyramid is probably incomplete. I wouldn't say wrong necessarily, but certainly incomplete. So then how do we account for the ability of the mind to see beyond the local body? Well, you can make up signaling kinds of theories, and there are lots of theories which don't disturb this knowledge pyramid too much. But if to make a very simple explanation, we can simply expand the pyramid a little bit on the bottom and put consciousness at the bottom of the pyramid. We'll simply assume, as in Eastern philosophy, that there's some aspect of reality which is simply awareness. It's a given. That's the bottom line. And from awareness arises space and time, and from that arises matter and energy, and then the rest of the knowledge pyramid is correct. Except that consciousness doesn't arise at the top of the pyramid, it actually permeates the entire thing. And so a philosopher might call this panpsychism. As I said, in some aspects of Eastern philosophy and some Western as well, it's called idealism. It's considered the basis of Hinduism and so on. So my guess is that if you're looking for a simple explanation, it is conceptually simpler to imagine that consciousness is simply a fundamental aspect of the universe, which is why my first book was called The Conscious Universe. And the consciousness we're talking about is not what humans think of as consciousness, but something like a more primordial form of awareness. It's simply built into the fabric of reality. I don't obviously don't know that that's true, but as I said, it's a simpler way of thinking about how would we explain these anomalies called psi. Well, if it's part of the fabric of reality, then it becomes pretty simple to explain. It's much more difficult to explain if you try to craft something where there's some unknown sense, or we've missed something about the neurosciences, or there's some way that we need to plug in a new aspect of physics or something like that. It's just if Occam's razor is our guideline on the way that we think about things, and consciousness must be fundamental in some way.
I completely concur. Well, Dr. Radin, seeing how you study psychokinetic effects on living systems at a distance, people already know that this is not a field with a particular curriculum to study. How did you go about creating a method of study that did not previously exist? What path did you take to obtain funding to further your research and create the Institute of Noetic Sciences?
That's about 5 questions.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
First of all,
pathway then.
Okay, so I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. The systematic study of psi phenomena started in 1882 with the formation of the Society for Psychical Research in London. Before that, you can trace it all the way back to at least Francis Bacon, the proto-scientist in the 1500s, who essentially put empiricism on the map. He was one of the first people, along with Galileo and Copernicus and the other founders of modern science, to suggest that the way to study the world is to experiment with it. You ask a question of nature, and nature will give you a response, and you can use that as a way of figuring out things. Because prior to that, most of it was basically philosophy. You would reason how things were and actually not look. And among other things, that led Aristotle to make a number of mistakes. For example, he, in Aristotle's form, which for thousands of years was held to be the scientific truth about everything, he said that the common housefly had 4 legs and 2 wings. And that's not true. The housefly has 6 legs, like most insects. But so why for 2,000 years did people accept Aristotle when they could have just looked at a housefly? Well, because up till that point, it was maybe somebody would see a housefly with 6 legs, and they would say, well, this one must be a mutant of some type, because Aristotle said it only has 4 legs. So Francis Bacon said and wrote that the way to advance our knowledge is to actually look at the world and test it. And interestingly, back in one of his very original books on this, he was writing about what he called the force of imagination. And that's what we would term intention. So he said if you wanted to test the force of imagination on the world, you could toss dice and then see whether that force would influence the dice. So 300 years before J.B. Rhine started testing a gambler's claim that you could test the roll of dice test the power of the mind by rolling dice, you had Francis Bacon already, at the very origins of empiricism, talking about the use of tossed dice. So I'm following along this long legacy of pretty much iconoclastic scientists who felt that existing science was quite good, but there were some anomalies that were being overlooked. And some people are attracted to anomalies because they're, at least from my perspective and others who have done this, that's where the exciting science is. It's all about exploring something that's unexplained and may change our understanding of the future, like the anomalies where the future breakthroughs are. So if I've developed anything new, it's probably just one paradigm that's being used now called presentiment, which is unconscious physiological forms of precognition. So that's something that I've developed. But even there are people who were using similar methods before. I just figured out a simpler way of doing it, which is getting good results. So I'm not doing anything completely original, and it's very rare in science to find that. As for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, this was founded by the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man on the moon. And he founded the Institute because on the way back from the moon to the Earth, he had a full-blown mystical experience where he felt that his mind and his awareness was completely the same, was identical to the universe at large. So that this is a form of what you would say in Sanskrit is samadhi. It's a deep absorption, unity type of experience. And it was so strong, such a palpable experience, not simply an imagination, that as a Navy pilot and an astronaut and a scientist, and he came back to the Earth, he was so intrigued by this experience that he was determined to use the best methods that we have to study it. And so the best methods we have for studying anything at this point is scientific methods. And so the Institute's mission originally was, and still is mostly, to use the tools of science to explore the frontiers of consciousness, or to put it simpler form, rather than exploring outer space, to explore inner space, which maybe actually there are two of the last frontiers. One of the last frontiers is studying the rest of the galaxy and the universe, and the other one is studying inside this inner space. How do you fund this kind of research, given that it's not within the mainstream?
Yes.
And to demonstrate that it's not within the mainstream, and that there's a paradox associated with all this, if you ask the general population of some 7 billion people around the world, roughly 60% have a very strong belief in psychic phenomena, and virtually 100% are interested in it, because they may be very skeptical about it and don't believe it for a whit, but at least they're interested. There's almost nobody doesn't care. So you have basically the whole population of the planet who are interested in a positive or negative way about this topic. And usually when you have that level of interest, you have the ability to get an advanced college degree up to PhD and maybe beyond in these topics. Because, for example, you can get a PhD with a dissertation on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's whole curricula having to do with popular culture and television and movies and so on, and sports, because we find it interesting. But if you go around the world and you say, well, where can I get a PhD in this kind of research? The answer is nowhere. There isn't a single accredited academic place where you can go and get a PhD specifically on this topic in a department that is devoted to it. Now, you can go to the UK, where there are about a dozen universities that have faculty members now where you could specialize in this topic, and some have. There's something about like 70 psychologist PhDs who have done something about parapsychology as part of their dissertation. But that only came about as a result of one endowed chair of psychology at the University of Edinburgh. So the UK is now the world center for this kind of research. But can you go someplace to a department that is devoted to this and get a degree? And the answer is no, nowhere in the world. So far less than 1% of the academic world, which is something like 10 or 15,000 institutions of higher learning, have any faculty at all who are known for their interest in this topic, either positive or negative, which is interesting. And so here we're faced with somewhere between a paradox and a taboo. You have the entire world interested in it, and yet you can't find this happening in the academic world. So that means that if you're interested in this, as I am and about 200 colleagues around the world who are scientists, you go to private foundations, you go to wealthy individual donors, and there it's difficult to define and cultivate such relationships, but it's not impossible because of so many people who are interested in these things. So in the future, we can imagine sometime that if we're lucky, the taboo will be broken. And I suspect that the taboo will be broken within science as we develop a better understanding of the way that the physical world works, especially as we understand more about quantum biology, because that will open a plausibility argument for why people report these kinds of effects. It'll give a theory that would be comfortable for science.